2, 1. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's Mr. Glennen again. We're in the middle of Weathering and Erosion chapter, and I have a guest speaker, a guest teacher here today. Mr. Miller is a teacher at Chief Joe in Richland. So if any of you guys know anybody that goes to Chief Joe, it's a middle school in Richland, ask them if they know Mr. Miller, and I bet you they do. So Mr. Miller and I are going to read, it's Reading Science, I believe it's Reading B. It's posted in your online STEM Scopes online science book. So please pull that up, have it open. If you're lucky enough to have two screens, you could probably have the book open on one side, and on the other side you could have the clarifying bookmark so you could follow along. So we're going to do this, and we're looking forward to hearing from you guys. And it's great to see you again. I know most of you guys are watching the videos every day, so it's great to have you back. All right, here we go. Mapping erosion control. Have you ever noticed that plastic fencing around a building site and wondered why it's there? The answer is erosion control. Before an architect begins to design a building, she must conduct a site survey. One of the steps in a site survey is to look at the elevations of the building site and surrounding areas. I can summarize this part by saying that architects always have to look at the site and the elevation of the site before they build a building to help them plan what to do.
Awesome, Mr. Glennen. I agree with what you're saying. I just like to add the word elevation has to do with like an elevator going up and down, just like the terrain goes up and down. So elevation is relative to the elevation above sea level. So with that, I'd like to continue with the reading. We're on paragraph number 2. It's great to be with you today. Always a pleasure working with Mr. Glennen. You boys and girls are so lucky to have him as your science and math teacher. So with paragraph 2, first word, if you please like to follow along, is elevations. Elevations are found on topographical maps. Topographic maps show large and small hills, streams, rivers, valleys, and man-made features. This information helps architects decide where to build the structure on the site. It would not be a good idea to place a structure near a river that could erode away all of the sediment from under the building. The architect also has to consider where people will park their cars. If the land is too steep, the cars could roll down the hill. Much of the information needed to properly design the building site is shown on a topographic map. So I can summarize this part by saying that topographical maps are things that you can find almost anywhere when you Google it. It's an option that you get on your map or on your screensaver there. And it shows you the elevation, once again, relative to sea level, but the way they show it is with lines that could best be described as looking down on a wedding cake.
I like that. I agree with your summary, and I can add that I'm familiar with topographical maps because before we ride, we typically look at a map and kind of get a feel for how much uphill we've got, how much downhill we have, and what the elevation change is like before we start a ride, so we know how much climbing, how long it's going to take. Very cool. Paragraph 3. After the architect decides where to place the building on the site, she must consider erosion. Before building can begin, the trees will be cut down. All the plants will be scraped away by bulldozers. Water is a major cause of erosion, but plants hold soil in place. After the vegetation is gone from the site, rain will cause the soil to move downhill. Using the topographic map, the architect will be able to predict what direction the soil will move. She will tell the builder where to place fences to stop erosion. This is why the information from the topographic map is so valuable. So this reminds me, I know something about this because last summer Mr. Miller and I rode our bikes to Vancouver, which is near Portland, and a friend of ours built his house. And I remember that he had lots of extra support around the bottom of his house to keep all the erosion from eroding the soil away, which would end up damaging the foundation and therefore damaging his house. So this is really cool. We both saw this.
Yeah, that's I can connect with that as well, Mr. Glennon. As I remember our friend's house, it reminded me. It was built on a hill. It's built on a hill, and it reminded me a lot of the way we terrace the landscape to flatten it out and make it level to build on. Like even like the rice paddies over in China, how they're all terraced out on the hills. I made a connection with the terrace. So that's great. We're on to paragraph number 4. First word is the. If you please follow along. The plastic fences around building sites are called silt fences. Silt is a very fine, small sediment. These fences are placed at the bottom of a hill or along a roadway. The silt fences keep the eroding soil from going into the waterway, such as a stream or into a drainage system of a city or a town. If the silt gets into a stream, sediment deposition can dam up the stream and cause flooding upstream and a loss of water downstream. So it's kind of a loss on both ends there. So what I find confusing about this is, well, actually not confusing. Why I'm making a connection actually is with the word sediment. It reminds me of the sedimentary layer we learned about in geography class.
Yeah, sediment also reminds me, when I think of sediment, I think of the sand and particles in the bottom of a stream. So I remember always hearing about, oh, look at the sediment. It's something that easily washes away with the water. Very cool. All right, paragraph 5. Now, here's what's interesting. Paragraph 5 is talking about the original 2 pictures at the beginning of the video. So I want you guys to look, at the beginning of the article. So there's two pictures, and I'll post these along with this video, so it'll be easier once you get to paragraph 5. You can take a look at the picture and understand. Look at these 2 satellite photographs of the Parachu River in Tibet. You will see what happens when erosion happens on a large scale. The top picture shows the Parachu River after it has been blocked. Can you see the landslide in the lower right corner? This landslide was caused when heavy rains loosened the top of the hill. Gravity caused them to slide down into the river. The large blue area is a landslide lake that was formed as the landslide blocked the river. You can also see how wide the river has become. So this part kind of confuses me a little because I don't understand why were they trying to make a lake, or we have enough information here, but if you look at the 2 pictures, maybe if we had the pictures in front of us, it confuses me a little because I don't understand, were they trying to make a lake or something, or was it a mistake?
Yes, I can help with that. If we go back and we read that, Mr. Glennon, I believe it's the 3rd line there. Can you see the landslide in the lower right corner? The landslide was caused when heavy rains loosened the soil and rock at the top of a hill. Gravity caused them to slide down into the river. The large blue area is a landslide lake that was formed after the landslide blocked the river. So yeah, I would infer from the reading that it did happen naturally, although I know humans can account for a lot of erosion and sediment and landslides based on the way we develop and we build. But with that, I'd like to read paragraph 6. The first word is the, if you please follow along. The bottom photograph was taken almost a year later. The water has started to drain out of the lake. The lake has gotten smaller and the river behind it is not as wide. It is obvious that the land around the lake has hills and valleys. Satellite photographs like this give clear picture of different erosional features such as landslides and deltas. These pictures allow scientists to study the features of changes over time. I'd like to summarize this part by saying that this reminds me a lot of what we talked about in the first paragraph about how scientists are constantly looking at the satellite images and surveying the land to understand, how it's changing and how it might change.
I agree with your summary, and I can add that, I don't know how many times we click on Google Map after we're looking at a map of, let's say, Othello, and when you click on satellite view, you can see the actual picture from the satellites above, and it really gives you a good idea of where roads go, especially gravel roads like what we ride our bikes on. So we are very used to looking at the satellite pictures, ladies and gentlemen. So Mr. Miller and I do that quite a bit. Paragraph 7. Scientists can use topographic maps together with satellite views to gain vast amounts of information. Topographic maps don't change much unless there's a catastrophic natural disaster, such as when a volcano explodes. During a catastrophic event, satellite pictures can change daily. A satellite view can show the visual difference as seasons change. Satellite photos show how much vegetation is present from one season to the next. This allows scientists to predict how well vegetation will prevent erosion when rains start. Scientists can lay the satellite view of the vegetation over the topographic map and predict erosional patterns. This allows cities and towns to undertake erosion control measures, retaining walls, or plant more vegetation to prevent landslides from occurring. I have read or heard something about this when a few years ago there was a serious catastrophic forest fire in the Columbia Gorge outside of Portland, and worried about landslides, and so they actually, like a year, so because it rains all the time, and a landslide causes a road to be blocked off from traffic or landslide.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we live in such a dry environment as the Columbia Basin, but yet we still have to deal with erosion, even with water along the rivers. I know there's one section of the Yakima River between Richland and West Richland that is on a bend of the river, and if you've studied erosion, you know the bends of the rivers where the most erosion is going to happen. And the Department of Transportation has been dealing with this for a long time because the river is eroding a main route that connects Richland and West Richland together. And they put in these really long pylons, like these big long telephone poles. They jackhammered it into the ground, probably 30 or 40 feet, and then piled rocks all around them to hold that embankment in place. And so I'm sure they're using a lot of these technologies to do those types of things. So yeah, that's where I think the students may notice most of these things happening is along roadways, because they're always trying to maintain them and keeping them from eroding away. So that's a great connection. I'd like to continue with paragraph 8. If you'd like to follow along, please. The first word is in. In the past, topographers or map makers had to travel to the area where they were mapping to create a topographic map. Now, using satellites, scientists have been able to generate a complete digital topographic map of over 99% of the Earth. The map was created using measurements from an instrument called ASTER on NASA's Terra satellite. This technology is more accurate than the original way of creating topographic maps. So it's interesting that it talks about how we're using satellites, and topographic map makers are using these technologies. A friend of mine told me about a job that I can't remember the exact name of it, where they actually hire you to go out and verify that the map is correct. And a lot of it is just verifying if these old roads still exist and if they're passable or not. So even with all this high-tech equipment, it's interesting how we still have to have people on the ground verifying whether or not some of these routes are even passable or not.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with you, and I think the main idea of this part is that they're just talking about how important it is, the relationship between technology and then actually having people on the ground, making sure that that what's there, what they think they see, is really there. So paragraph 9. Being able to read topographic maps is a skill required in many careers. Geologists, architects, city planners, and engineers must all have this skill. Whether they're reading the older paper topographic maps or the newer digital topographic maps, these tools allow them to do their jobs very well. So I think the main point is, again, that the main idea of this part is the value of topographic maps, because we need to know about elevation change. Is there a hill? Is there a valley? That sort of thing. Things that are man-made, we need to know what's there so we know how to build around it or incorporate those of the project.
Yeah, I agree with you in your summary of the reading. This is really good in the sense of making connections, because this idea of erosion and the power of water, it's all around us. It's something that I think we need to understand and deal with to to have a good quality of living and a good quality of life. So hey, thanks for having me on board today, Mr. Glennen. This has been a lot of fun, and I look forward to seeing you guys again.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the document if I can get my cursor over there. But I wanted you guys to know that Mr. Miller is the guy that's in my room this year. And Mr. Miller was the key person behind getting me all those bikes. So I want to thank him again. And a lot of you have not only seen those, but a couple of you have actually benefited from those bikes being in. We want to thank Mr. Miller for joining us. Hopefully he'll come back. So, guys, have
Awesome.
a great
Thank
day.
you so much.
All right.
We'll see you next time. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you.